When you hear the word empire, what comes to mind? Armies, battles, flags waving over conquered lands, maps streaked in imperial colors. But in the 20th century, a new kind of empire emerged, one that didn't march on cities with tanks or soldiers. It spread quietly, through boardrooms, loan agreements, and policy directives. Its power came not from guns, but from signatures. And nowhere was this quiet force more evident than in Latin America. Here, international finance didn't just provide loans, it reshaped entire nations, determined policies, and influenced the lives of millions, all under the banner of stability. The irony is striking. The International Monetary Fund, or IMF, was founded in 1944 at the Bretton Woods Conference. Its stated mission was noble: stabilize exchange rates, prevent economic collapse, and help nations recover after the devastation of World War II. In theory, it was a global doctor arriving to heal wounded economies, to bring order, and to offer struggling countries a chance to thrive. But in Latin America, this doctor's prescription often came at a brutal cost. What was meant to stabilize became a mechanism to ensure foreign banks and creditors were paid first, even if it meant national economies were left in turmoil. To understand how the IMF gained such influence, we need to look at Latin America in the mid-20th century. Nations like Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina were racing to modernize. They protected local industries with tariffs, built state-owned enterprises, and subsidized basic necessities like food and fuel to maintain social peace. Politicians promised growth today, but the price was deferred to tomorrow. That tomorrow, as it turned out, would come with a staggering bill. The 1970s seemed like a golden era. Oil prices skyrocketed, petrodollars flowed into Western banks, and those banks were eager to lend. Latin American leaders saw an opportunity: borrow in dollars, fund infrastructure projects, support social programs, and maintain political popularity. Roads, dams, factories, and railways sprouted, financed largely by international loans. Growth appeared impressive, and political leaders basked in success. Yet beneath the surface, the clock was ticking. That clock struck in the early 1980s. Paul Volcker, then head of the Federal Reserve in the United States, raised interest rates sharply to combat inflation. Suddenly, loans that once seemed affordable became unbearable. A 5% interest rate could jump to 15 or 20% virtually overnight. Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina, once able to keep up with their debt, found themselves unable to pay. In 1982, Mexico's finance minister traveled to Washington and delivered a stark message: we cannot meet our debt obligations. This wasn't just a financial problem, it was a full-blown crisis, and waiting in the wings was the IMF. But the IMF's intervention wasn't a simple rescue. It came with conditions so severe that entire economies were rewritten. Governments had to slash subsidies for essential goods, devalue their currency, freeze wages, privatize state-owned companies, and cut spending on education, healthcare, and pensions. National budgets were effectively drawn not in local capitals, but in offices in Washington, D.C. And these budgets had one primary priority: ensure international creditors were repaid. Politicians often used the IMF as a political shield, blaming economic hardship on external forces, while citizens bore the consequences. Bread, fuel, and basic goods became more expensive, public workers lost jobs, and schools and hospitals struggled. Meanwhile, banks in New York, London, and Frankfurt remained protected. Between 1980 and 1990, GDP per capita fell across Latin America, marking the period as the lost decade. Inequality grew, poverty soared, and social unrest erupted through protests, strikes, and riots. Mexico was the first domino in 1982, when oil price collapses and rising interest rates made debt unsustainable, triggering a default that sent shockwaves through global markets. The IMF intervened, providing new loans under strict conditions. spending cuts, privatization of state industries, and trade liberalization, policies later called the Washington Consensus. While framed as stabilization and economic efficiency, these reforms dismantled social safety nets and transferred wealth from citizens to foreign creditors and investors, deepening dependence and inequality. Bolivia is a stark example. By 1985, it faced hyperinflation so extreme that prices were climbing thousands of percent in a single year. The IMF prescribed shock therapy. Subsidies were removed overnight, the currency was devalued, and public spending slashed. Inflation did fall, but the social cost was devastating. Bolivia is a stark example. By 1985, it faced hyperinflation so extreme that prices were climbing thousands of percent in a single year. The IMF prescribed shock therapy. Subsidies were removed overnight, the currency was devalued, and public spending slashed. Inflation did fall, but the social cost was devastating. Mines closed, unemployment soared, and entire communities were abandoned. Bolivia's economy stabilized on paper, but ordinary citizens bore the pain. Despite the human toll, IMF officials praised the model as a textbook success. Argentina illustrates another side of the IMF story. During the 1990s, the country implemented reforms aligned with IMF advice, pegging its currency to the dollar, privatizing industries, and cutting deficits. At first, it appeared successful. Foreign investment surged, and politicians touted Argentina as a model student of international financial orthodoxy. But beneath the surface, debt mounted, exports became uncompetitive, and social tensions simmered. By 2001, the system collapsed. Banks froze accounts, citizens lost savings overnight, and riots erupted in Buenos Aires. Argentines chanted, "Que se vayan todos," throw them all out. Once hailed as a savior, the IMF's reputation was in tatters. Across the region, the pattern repeated. Brazil faced austerity measures that controlled inflation but left inequality entrenched. Peru stabilized prices, but at the cost of dismantling worker protections. The story was always the same: stabilization for international creditors, stagnation for citizens. Politicians often cooperated willingly, knowing IMF intervention could provide a political scapegoat. When wages fell and subsidies vanished, leaders shrugged and blamed external necessity. The relevance of this history is more than academic. Non-developed nations, including those often considered developed, faced debts that would have alarmed Latin American leaders in the 1970s. Interest rates fluctuate, investor confidence can shift overnight, and fiscal pressure can create conditions for IMF-style interventions, even if the narrative is dressed in terms like responsible governance or market discipline. The mechanism is the same. National budgets adjusted to secure creditors, with ordinary people absorbing the cost. Debt is not merely a number, it is leverage. In Latin America, leaders used borrowing to promise immediate growth while pushing the cost to the future. The IMF transformed that debt into a tool of influence, dictating national priorities. As developed nations accumulate historic levels of debt, the same dynamics threaten wider populations. Today's fiscal warnings echo the past. When debt becomes unmanageable, someone else may decide how nations and their citizens must adjust. But this history also offers lessons. Understanding the mechanics of debt, savings, and financial leverage allows individuals to make smarter choices. Real wealth is not what systems promise on paper. It is tangible: skills, assets, and networks that maintain value even under economic stress. By learning from the past, ordinary people can protect themselves from repeating the mistakes that left Latin America's populations exposed during the lost decade. Latin America's experience in the 1980s is not just a cautionary tale, it is a blueprint for recognizing how global financial systems can operate. It shows the consequences when numerical targets and creditor interests outweigh human costs. Entire generations suffered, opportunity was stolen, and inequality deepened, all while the system above remained intact. Understanding this history equips us to see when similar forces may be at play, not just in distant countries, but potentially at home. So the next time you hear officials talking about balancing budgets, reducing deficits, or tough financial choices, remember who is often shielded from the consequences. Remember Latin America's lost decade. Remember that debt is more than money. It is control, leverage, and influence. And when the stakes are high, those who hold the numbers often hold the power.